Why is it important to say give them an argument and not, the opposite of that, which is, I guess, I don't know what the opposite of that is.
Well, let me actually jump in real quick, because there was something, I think that's the most important question, right? Because contrary to what people might think, like, I actually don't love a lot of attention. Like, I don't go out of my way to like draw a lot of attention to myself on social media and stuff. And I'm a pretty private person outside of what I do at TYT and on this show. So like, doing more on camera debating and discussing politics is like already kind of painful for me, but doing it in like the type of environment I did it in, this was the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce. No one there was a supporter of mine, save for one employee at the venue that we had the debate at, and my husband who came with me. And so I did it because whether I like it or not, Ben Shapiro has a massive, massive following. And for someone who might not be super informed on politics or how our economic system really works, look, he's really clever in the way he frames his arguments. He talks quickly with a lot of confidence, and people think that he's right on the issues. Remember, he's the one who popularized the phrase, the facts don't care about your feelings. So he's really positioned himself as this like logical guy who puts feelings aside to debate the facts, to put the facts out there. And so for me, it wasn't about convincing Ben of anything, or even, of course, convincing the Chamber of Commerce of anything. I just knew that because he has a big following, people are going to weigh in on the debate. And it's going to give me an opportunity to like, hopefully further popularize what we stand for. And maybe even convince some on the right who might have been convinced to misdirect their anger toward the powerless to like really rethink the power structures in the country. So again, it's not about legitimizing anyone or validating anyone. It's the exact opposite of that. It's about putting myself in a situation where I can, confront the misconceptions or confront the things that I think are wrong in real time, and then allow for that to just kind of spread as it has on the internet, where it gets a lot of attention, both from his audience and also from people who follow my work.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I should also say that I think, I guess basically I'd say two things about why to debate these people. One of them is, because a lot of people will say, on the left, oh, you shouldn't do this. Sometimes they'll I think I actually saw Anna talking about this on Twitter. The people were saying that she was platforming Ben Shapiro, which is hilarious because
number one Facebook account in the universe.
Yeah. We actually have some graphics showing that. These are recent graphics. Recent numbers from Facebook's top 10. He doesn't just
it's nice to see I love pause is number one, and then everything else.
Every single this account does this like every day. They show the like top like the 10 Facebook accounts that have had like the most like and share things the last 24 hours. Every single day, always at least one of them is Ben Shapiro. Sometimes like four of them are Ben Shapiro. Yeah. And unfortunately, we live in a much better world if this were the case. But unfortunately, like Jacobin is never in the top 10, right? Like, what we believe just reaches a much smaller audience than what they believe. I mean, like that's just the sort of bottom line, arithmetic of it. And so this idea that in context that both audiences will pay attention to, which is what a debate is. And I think one of the reasons it's so important, because we live in a time, actually this came up a little bit in Anna's debate with Ben Shapiro, where the media is incredibly fragmented. And I really liked, by the way, that Anna kept talking about profit incentives when explaining how this works. And Ben's explanation for why the media was so fragmented, I'm not making this up, was, well, it's because of distrust, because of like liberal media bias. Like, yeah, I mean, okay, the right wing was complaining about that in 1954. That's not why traditional media has collapsed. It's changing technology and changing economics. Is why that's happened. But because it has happened, and people generally don't access things outside of their media bubbles, because now everybody can curate their own little media diet. If I somebody is a right winger, they can like have all the time watching the news they could ever ask for without ever encountering anybody to the left of to the left of Brit Hume, right? Or maybe even not even that far left if somebody, and that there are good things about this, that voices that were excluded from the sort of traditional media that Chomsky and Herman were talking about in Manufacturing Consent, now I think have a little bit more of a chance to find their audiences. I mean, that's obviously right, stuff like this show. But the bad thing about it is that it makes it even harder to break through those bubbles, to get people, to access people in the other ones. And you're just not going to, if I do, if I do a segment on Ben Shapiro on my show, or you guys do one on this show, that's great. I think there's value in that. I think it gives people who watch it talking points and ammunition, when they engage with people they might know who take those arguments seriously. But nobody who likes Ben Shapiro is going to see that. Whereas if you debate Ben Shapiro, then you're actually speaking to his audience. And when people raise these worries about platforming and all of that, it seems to be that they think that Ben Shapiro is so persuasive that like leftists who would have been rooting for Anna are going to see that and start becoming facts don't care about your feelings conservatives. But one, just mathematically, that's a bizarre worry. That they already have an audience that's like 20 trillion times the size of our audience. We stand to benefit from this, even all else being equal, much more than they do. And two, that's just like kind of a depressing failure of confidence in what we stand, like that we think that we're that unpersuasive, that we're more worried that that the comparatively small number of people who agree with us are going to be swayed by them than vice versa. And I guess last thing I'd say about this is just that a lot of people, I think, and this is what like a lot of that first book was about, like will conflate a couple different things. One is Ben Shapiro going to be convinced? Is Charlie Kirk going to be convinced? Of course not. That's not the, you're never trying to persuade the other person on the stage or the other side of the YouTube screen. And the question is not, will the most hardcore fan be convinced? Because again, it's not. The question is, anybody who's watching who might be somewhat sympathetic to these figures, but is also, is somewhat sympathetic, to these figures, but but isn't married to it, right? And is somewhat open, or maybe who even used to be a hardcore fan, but just happens to be in a place in their life where they're open to hear another perspective. That's who you're talking to. And it can actually be really effective. Like anybody who does this has certainly heard those testimonials about people who have, who have come around. And it's also just often really unconvincing, like, because I've never heard somebody say, oh, nobody has ever really convinced by this stuff. Every single time where I actually know something about that person's life, they've always changed their mind about big things. And it's like, so did you just do that randomly? Did you have reasons? Is maybe somebody, compelling doing this? And I think in particular, what I liked about Anna's Ben Shapiro debate is the way it was obvious that it's like, okay, the Chamber of Commerce definitely not going to be convinced. There were a few phones thrown to like, oh, hey, here's something that you guys want that's like so greedy and self-destructive that it'll even hurt you. But like, I think you got that, like, okay, the Chamber of Commerce is not going to, is not going to be on your side under any circumstances. So let's pitch this to the larger audience, the much bigger audience that's going to see this. And I love that opening presentation, it was all about like, hey, here's what people's lives are like. You could improve it by organizing a union and, going on strike and all that stuff and ignoring the culture war distractions. and which I love as a message, but also I love that forced Ben Shapiro in some of his responses to be like, well, actually, I think the culture war is very important, right? So it's like, okay, perfect, right? Make him be the one who's like, hey, this annoying, endless thing that just permeates everything right now? I like it. I want it to go on forever.
Notice that as we're discussing capitalism and the economy, he's not as confident as he is when he's discussing something like critical race theory, right? So before we get to that stuff, I do want to talk a little bit about this moment. Ben got checked by me after he kept talking about how great it is that capitalism and profit motives exist. He thinks they're wonderful. Here he is, and here's the moment I'm talking about.
I mean, so obviously I don't consider profit motive a dirty word. In fact, I think the profit motive is one of the single greatest things that has ever happened to humanity, is when people began to realize that innovation was going to create greater wealth for them and for the people who actually got their products. This is one of the things that has progressed humanity just enormously since the beginning of the 1800s. The profit motive is a wonderful, wonderful thing. It is not a negative thing. Now,
it depends on what you're talking about, though. Wasn't a positive thing in Texas with their privatized, deregulated power grid, which led to 210 Texans dying because they didn't want to spend the money necessary to weatherize their equipment. So there are certain areas where profit motive is, in fact, a dirty word. So I want to just clarify that.
No, I mean, when the state is involved with profit motive, then you have a real problem. The state paying for power, for example, or when you have the state driving regulations toward, for example, green energy and subsidizing particularly less effective forms of energy because they have an incentive in order to do so that is not paid off for by the risk they take, that also drives some really bad incentive structures.
So he's just kind of like, if you're paying attention to what he's saying, it really doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And there's actually, I think shortly after that or around that part of it, there's a place where you brought up, because it was a big, conservative talk. It feels like 100 years ago. It was a big conservative talking point during the Obama administration that the government had funded Solyndra, they'd given them a subsidy, and it had gone under. He said, okay, but also Tesla, right? Was a result of not, the profit motive, leading to innovation, but state planning leading to innovation, and then the profits being privatized, which is exactly what happened. And he said, okay, well, there's Tesla, but there's also government, when the government subsidizes research, sorry, I can't talk fast enough to actually sound like Ben Shapiro. I'm gonna stop trying. But he says this, and he says, oh, there are like 100 other cases, where they subsidize things and nothing came out. And I just watched that. I thought, what? Yes, of course. You're literally describing how science works, how technological progress works. You try a bunch of different things, and most of them don't work out, but then some do. That's how experimental research works. That's how developing any technology works. That you have to have some sort of process whereby a bunch of false starts are tried, and then you find the stuff, the stuff that actually works. But of course, Ben talks so quickly and he sounds so confident that in the moment, it's easy to just hear that and be like, oh, good point, Ben. That's, and actually what he's describing is exactly why it's nonsense to say that the profit motive is the only thing that brings forward technological change, because this is actually a huge problem because, trying a bunch of things that might someday lead to something that, that might have a good result is incredibly unprofitable, right? Mm-hmm. You're taking a big short-term loss. This is why after MERS and SARS, people, the pharmaceutical companies, weren't all over, trying to research, coronaviruses, because that's, you're sinking money into something that might pay off at some time in the future, but that's not really, what the stockholders want to hear right now.
Right.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, hearing you guys talk, one of the things that people don't understand about how people are convinced of something is that it's not the Aaron Sorkin West Wing version where, there's a debate to be had and the disgusting right winger is like, you know what, sir, your arguments, shaking their hand and tip of the hat to
or
you.
they're just like
And,
the Republicans in the West Wing. They're always just stunned into silence, by
Yeah.
Martin's eloquence. It's like, no, they're just going to
and
keep talking. They're going to keep saying all the bullshit they usually say. But
Right.
ideally, and this is, by the way, why I hate the sort of like Oxford Union style debate where people like take votes at the end, like as if that proves anything about anything.
No.
Because the way persuasion normally works, all the times in my life I've ever heard a good argument for something I didn't already think or that I disagree with. I was just annoyed by it originally. I think that's like how humans usually work. The way persuasion works is it's like over time you think back to it, you're like, when you have a little bit less ego at stake, I'm not saying Ben Shapiro, I think he's hopeless, right? But like people who actually are persuadable who might watch this, you think back to it and you're like, wait a second, that didn't make sense.
Yeah. It's like you plant a little seed and the seed is almost imperceptible. But if you poke a hole in an argument, and I think that one of the things that they say also about persuasion is that once you poke the hole, if you kind of shut up, and like don't insist upon it, you're almost like like the hard part is realizing when you've poked it, enough. Yeah. But the best thing you can do is shut up and like walk away. And in the moment, the person will feel very annoyed and feel very, like you said, flustered by it and angry at you. But that seed then germinates over time, and they probably don't even remember. They probably won't even remember what was the thing that caused it.
Yeah, when they
might germinate
thinking about this.
Yeah,
yeah.
Exactly, and they might not even remember the exchange or whatever. But that is how you persuade people. So if you debate someone like Ben Shapiro or Charlie Kirk, for the people in their audience or the people out in the world, if you can poke a hole in their argument and show kind of like an inconsistency or like have like a moment where like there's like a laugh line or something, and then you just kind of let it sit.
Yeah. No, totally. In fact, I want to get to the rest of the videos because I think that there's an example of that, right? Mm-hmm. There were multiple moments where I wanted to interrupt him. And to be fair, I do interrupt him a few times to poke the holes, right?
Yeah.
But there were moments where he was just rambling on, and it wasn't really making sense. And I was like, give him enough rope, right? So let's start with the first clip on that. Here, Ben is rambling about how awesome capitalism is.
I don't think the capitalist class exists in opposition to the worker class. I don't think that my workers, the people who work for my company exist in opposition to me. I think that I really don't know many people who run businesses who are out to quote unquote exploit their labor and treat them like garbage. I don't think that is something that they wake up seeking to do. I think that in fact what private business has done is drive competition for labor in ways that non-private industry has never done. Public companies are publicly owned companies, particularly nationalized industries, are not famous for treating their workers extraordinarily well. The notion that private companies treat their workers horrifically and that all labor is exploitative, except if you work for the government, which doesn't have any incentive to treat you well at all because you obviously can't do anything, it's the government, is I think wrong. I'm not opposed to unions so long as they're not kneecapping people or so long as they're not forcing anybody into a labor arrangement they don't wish to work under. But the notion that the labor arrangements ought to be general on behalf of people who have not voluntarily signed up for the labor arrangement seems to me skewed.
As an employer, right, it's not that you have to be awful to your employees, but you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders to return, to provide a return on their investment. That's literally like it's baked into the system.
That's true.
And so as a result, I mean, what's the most expensive cost within a business?
It's always labor.
It's always labor. So when we talk about exploitation, right? Exploitation always makes it seem like you're actively brutal and awful to your employees, which in some cases that does happen. But it doesn't even have to get that far. The whole point is to extract as much labor for the lowest possible price.
That can only happen in a monopolistic situation.
In order to increase profits and provide a return of investment to your shareholders. That's just the way the system works.
That's wrong.
Yes. What I love about this whole thing is that even though Ben's whole thing is that he speaks very quickly and he sounds very confident about whatever he's saying, as you pointed out a minute ago, he did a lot of like rambling and stonewalling in this, and you could tell that he was flustered, that he got under his skin a little bit because like he doesn't like he doesn't quite know what to say, and so he's just going to kind of keep talking about it for a little while, which is definitely what's going on there.
He's been trained to debate like leftists in college, like some like blue-haired college kid or whatever, like not a seasoned pro.
No, exactly. I mean, unironically,
seriously.
yes. Like that is exactly right. And what I love so much about that contrast is first that he is, like I don't know, like it almost sounds like his feelings are hurt. Like, people just try to treat the workers like garbage, and it's ironically, for the facts don't care about your feelings guy, kind of emotional. And then in Anna's response, she's very calm. She's laughing a little bit, but then she gives this like very like this very like level explanation of like, no, I'm not talking about like the thought, like the feelings, that happened to happen in some capitalist heads. I'm talking about this is literally how the system works. And she gives this like very clear, very intuitive explanation of how it works structurally. And his response is to say, well, that's only true in a monopolistic situation, which just clearly not, right? I mean, the idea that only in monopolies is there an incentive to try to, pay workers the least you can get away with paying them. And then, I mean, if you think about it more, what he's really saying is like, in like some hypothetical Econ 101 fantasy of perfect competition where there were lots and lots of different jobs that you could go to where like the situation of a worker with like choosing employers was the same as the situation of like a consumer driving past one gas station to fill up at another one where it's 10 cents cheaper, that it was just that easy to change employers. So the idea, I think, doesn't make sense on reflection, but also even in the moment, if you're listening to that as a normal person, very clear, very intuitive explanation of what exploitation means, and then a response that's just like basically, I don't think he expects any normal person to listen to that and have any idea what he's talking about. That's only true in a monopolistic situation. That's just Ben's way of saying, well, trust me, I know a lot about economics.
Yeah, it's just words that doesn't need to make a whole lot of sense. It's just like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, totally, dude. It's one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, he speaks super confidently, and also like I just want to note, I was super, I'm going to say nervous. I was nervous about the event because I know I'm walking into an environment that is not very friendly to what we believe. And I didn't know what to expect with Ben personally because, Cenk Uygur had debated him in 2017 and it got pretty nasty, especially the aftermath of that. So I didn't know what to expect. And I kind of had my guard up, but he was incredibly friendly, incredibly nice and like warm. And I want to give him props for that because it didn't feel fake. It felt like he was just, even though we disagree deeply on politics and culture, he just seems to be like a nice guy, right? So yeah, so there's that. And then I wanted to just end with the final video, which was how the overall situation ended. This is a little lengthier, but I love the ending here. So let's watch.
It's an economic fallacy that there is an impoverishment of workers that goes on under a laissez-faire capitalist system in which companies are actually competing for a commodity. Labor is a commodity. When you have companies that are competing for the same labor, the price of labor goes up. And this is one of the great fallacies of Marxist theory, is that there would be a general impoverishment of workers that would lead to the workers of the world rising. The fact is the living standards in industrial countries have been rising steadily, and that living standards in non-industrialized countries, non-capitalist countries have been crap for nearly all of human history.
Wages have been stagnant since the 1970s. So the argument that, these companies are competing for labor, it's a cute argument until you take a look at the actual data.
What happened to labor? What happened to
decades
labor between 1800 and 1970, and has the government grown smaller or larger since 1970?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up that time period because the largest expansion of the middle class happened following the New Deal. And the New Deal redistributed wealth and,
By the way,
certainly gave a lot more power to the worker in the workplace.
That's
been rolled back since.
Since the 1970s, the notion that the middle class has been destroyed is a fallacy. The middle class has largely become the upper middle class.
Nearly 50% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. I think
pains me to interrupt this discussion because it is fascinating. I know we started off by saying I heard the word agree 10 times, but we brought you here specifically for these discussions because you don't always agree. But
I feel like the conversation was always cut short once we would get into it with economic policy, which was frustrating because I wanted to keep going. But anyway, it was a good ending, I guess.
No, I think that was actually a perfect ending because, like, what we just saw, right? There's like a solid minute of, Ben trying very hard, but sounded very unconvincing. Like he's just kind of throwing out like a lot of disconnected talking points. He's calling everything a fallacy, which by the way, I can't help myself not what that word means, but he's doing all of that. And you just kind of keep bringing him down to earth, but it's like, okay, but when was the biggest expansion of the middle class? When was the what are you talking about? Wages have been stagnating, but people can't afford this $400 emergency. And I think the best you could hope for is that they're going to cut you off, and so the whole thing is going to end at a point where you're so clearly in the argument about something that like he's clearly, like you said earlier, he wants to talk about critical race theory. He wants to talk about masks. These things are catnip, for his base. And,
Superman is gay now, dude. He's fucking gay, Superman.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
He's gay Superman.
Gay. Yeah.
like them being upset about gay Superman and people yelling at them about it and them saying, oh, you're triggered much. Like that's the conversation they want to have. How is it that ordinary people can't afford a $400 emergency in the richest country on the earth is obviously not the conversation they want to have. And by the way, I love the fact he's putting all this emphasis on employers having to compete for workers, because what have we seen in like the last 6 months? Continually, the Ben Shapiros of the world, conservatives, small business owners, managers of Taco Bells, Republican uncles on Facebook, constantly whining about the fact that we are for once in a situation where they actually do have to compete for labor, and that actually does put them at the structural disadvantage. That code shows so clearly that what they're used to is that not even remotely being the case.
Well, the other thing is that, and he kind of hinted at it in that clip, but it's something that it's the kind of argument of last resort for right-wingers, but also like many kind of like hardcore liberals, I would describe him as, or like, the Steven Pinker types, which is that their argument of last resort is that like, no, actually things are good. You just don't appreciate them. That like, like, it's just like, actually, no, it's all great. You just like, you people are just, like you can't appreciate it. Like when you're like, 50% of Americans can't afford a $400 bill. That sounds bad. It's like, no, you idiot. Actually, they're just unappreciative children who are spoiled and, can't appreciate the fact that, I don't know, they have Netflix and they have all the entertainment in the world or something. Like that's their argument of last resort, that just the things are great, but people just don't appreciate them.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, at the very beginning of the debate, the moderator, who, of course, is Chamber of Commerce guy, so the two kinds of questions that he asked, as prompts were either like kind of vapid platitude questions, like, oh, what gives you hope about, this generation, and, just sort of like putting together sort of vague feel-good buzzwords, generation, hope, stuff like that, or else questions of the form, here's a right-wing argument, what do you guys think? Like those were the two kinds of questions. There was never, here's a left-wing argument, what do you guys think? But in one of his attempts to tee it up with a right-wing argument, he said, like, I don't remember who this is a quote from, but I've heard a couple of these people use it anyway. He said, somebody or other said, well, America is not a failure, it's a disappointment, something like that. In other words, like, oh, hey, we're not perfect, we don't always live to our ideals, gosh darn it, we're trying our best. And Ben Shapiro, in responding to that, he was angry even at the claim that America could be a disappointment because he said, oh, what do you compare it to? Perfection? It's like, no, motherfucker, I'm comparing it to Canada, right? Where people get healthcare as a human right. Like, compared to that, yes, right now it's a disappointment. And honestly, the idea that, like, oh, I love my society so much that I don't want it to improve in any way to make life better for the people who live in it, I think is probably, I hope, going to be intuitively unconvincing to most persuadable people in that audience. I should say, by the way, that obviously people don't have context for this because the Kirk debate doesn't come out, for another week, the video. But the shirt that I'm wearing today, it's a post office shirt, and
nice.
That was given to me by one of the people, the third party, group, that organized the whole thing. They sent that to me kind of as a joke because of the moment in the debate that very clearly Charlie Kirk, and I suspect, like, hopelessly drank the Kool-Aid conservative viewers will regard as the biggest own of me, which is when we were arguing about whether to make something public. I don't remember if it was healthcare or what it was. And Kirk says, so you want it to be run like the post office? And I said, what are you talking about? The post office is amazing. And, he was just incredulous about that. Like, everybody knows the post office sucks. So I tried to make, in the sort of most normally accessible possible language, the basic points that, one, screw you if you talk to, like, certainly in terms, if you want to talk about, like, racial equity and upward mobility, like, any Black person over a certain age who went to college, 50-50 chance they were able to do that because their dad had a good unionized job at the post office. And two, it'll bring a letter from Phoenix where that debate was being held to rural Alaska for 50 cents. That's an objectively amazing service.
Totally.
But of course, from their perspective, it's like, oh, haha, post office. Everybody knows that's like, if government is bad.
Yeah,
you need to watch the Kevin Costner film, The Postman, to really appreciate the post
Kevin Costner. He's a national treasure. Yellowstone's a really good show. I don't know if you guys watch it, but you should. It's really
I've
good.
seen it. Most watched show on good. Most watched show on cable. No one knows. Like, none of these coastal elites watch it, but it's the most watched show on cable right now.
Yeah, it's really good. But no, I mean, I was just going to say, like, the post office is something that's totally taken for granted until there are disruptions to the post office, right? When people don't get their mail for a few days and they're like, what the fuck is going on? Like, they freak out about it. Yeah, it's an incredible service. It's so important. And honestly, a lot of these private delivery companies rely on the post office to get stuff shipped to rural parts of the country. I mean, Nando was touching on that earlier in the show, and it's absolutely correct.
Yeah, I mean, what the response, is, I guess, is always like the Dave Rubin thing that, like, oh, in the world without the post office, competition would kick in, and the free market would handle it, which is kind of what Ben Shapiro was at in one of the clips we watched earlier when he responded to your point that the profit motive is a very bad thing in contexts like energy, where it leads to stuff like what happened in Texas. And he said, well, it's bad when the government is involved because it's paying for it. So the implication is that if we just had a pure free market energy system, if you can't afford to heat your own home, or keep the electricity on to keep your kidney dialysis machine running, then tough luck for you. That fewer people would die if that happened, and of course that makes zero sense if you think about it for 10 seconds. But what he's doing is the equivalent of, like, if you or I we're like, oh, well, any possible problems with any socialist system that's ever existed, were only problems because it wasn't pure enough communism. Then everything would magically solved. Like he's just doing the right wing equivalent of that.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it was fun. I felt a little rusty. I hadn't like debated in a long time, but this show was like the single most important thing. Second was your show, Ben, because I was watching your debates, the way you guys
Thank you
analyze
for recognizing
debates.
my superiority to Ben.
Well, the thing is with Ben's show, I'm just like a passive viewer / listener. With this show, I'm actually having to do research and like really, really absorb the content that we're doing. And then of course, I mean, Nando, the Washington Post called you hunky and
That's
you
true.
do all this important, socialist commentary. Of course, I'm going to learn a lot. But I got like a little taste and like, I want to do it again. Like I really enjoyed it.
You smell blood in the water.
You should absolutely do more of this. I think just that like combination of just being really focused on the stuff that they don't want to talk about. I mean, just like channel your like Bernie Sanders sitting in the booth with Maureen Dowd waving around the list of topics he's willing to talk about. That it's like, oh, what do you think? Could AOC ever be president? I don't know. I'm going to talk about healthcare. Like channel that, right? Like whatever the question is, like the answer, get back to. It's incredibly fucked up that not everybody has healthcare, in this country, and then just like that, just the demeanor when you were like that last clip we watched, like just the demeanor that like you managed to pull off this thing where you're just like sort of amused that like Ben is being as ridiculous as he is about this, but like it's cool. You'll explain to him how this stuff actually works. Like I think the more of that we can see in debates like this, the better everything is.
Yeah, I thought about Michael a lot.
Yes.
I had a meeting with he introduced me to his like coach like 2 weeks before he passed, and I've been working with her ever since. And I told her the truth. I was like, it was a Thursday before the debate, and I just told her like, I'm nervous because this guy's actually, I know I'm right on the facts. It's just that it's debating is a skill, and he's really good at debating, right? So, but we talked about how incredible Michael was in communicating ideas that are usually like, there's so much propaganda against the ideas, and it's existed for such a long time. So he did a really good job in like being charming as fuck when he would express those ideas, right? So that's part of the reason why.
You gotta be charming when you express it, and then when the other guy's talking, just like roll your eyes comically, just like do the Trump thing. Mike would do that too. He would just be like, okay. If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.